It started with a screech, metal against metal, the kind of sound that makes your soul shrivel up. My heart lurched as I bolted outside, boots skidding on the dirt, only to find Karen's rust bucket of a minivan proudly wedged against my gate. Again. The same Karen who, just last month, tried to get my tractor towed because she didn't like the way it looked from her house down the road. The same Karen who declared that my farm, which has been in my family for 3 generations, was an eyesore to her property's value. And now, here she was, standing with her arms crossed, a smug smirk stretching across her heavily lipsticked mouth, as if blocking my only entrance for the second time in 2 weeks was some kind of civic duty. I inhaled deeply, counted to 3, and tried to calm the part of me that wanted to see if hay bales could be launched hard enough to dent a car door. I strode toward her, the air thick with manure, freshly tilled earth, and my barely concealed frustration. "Karen," I said, voice tight, "move your car." She let out a scoff, her perfectly manicured hand resting on her hip as she shifted her weight, making her entire stance scream defiance. "I told you last time, young man," she spat, despite the fact that I was at least 10 years older than her Botoxed forehead suggested. "I'm teaching you a lesson about respect." My fists clenched, but I forced them to relax because I knew how this woman operated. She thrived on chaos, bathed in unnecessary drama, and, most importantly, had the cops on speed dial. "Respect," I repeated, running a hand over my face, feeling the grit of a long morning's work still clinging to my skin. "Karen, you're blocking my farm's entrance. I have a delivery truck coming in an hour. You know, a truck filled with actual supplies for running a farm? The thing that keeps my business running." She waved me off, as if I had just explained the concept of oxygen to a fish. "Oh please. Your farm doesn't need another shipment of whatever it is you do." I looked it up. Farms are supposed to have fences and proper signage. This place looks like an abandoned junkyard. I stared at her, genuinely speechless for a moment. Was she seriously lecturing me about what a farm should look like? "Karen," I said slowly, as if speaking to a particularly dense brick wall, "move your car." She pursed her lips, then gasped theatrically, as if I had just insulted her entire bloodline. "Excuse me? You don't get to tell me what to do. This is a free country. And anyway, if you don't want your entrance blocked, maybe you should invest in a proper gate." The truck was due soon, and I didn't have time for this nonsense. I turned on my heel, deciding that if she wanted to play this game, fine. I had a tractor, and I had a Karen-sized problem that needed moving. But just as I reached for my keys, I heard the one sound that guaranteed my day was about to get a whole lot worse. A siren. I whipped back around to find Karen, phone pressed to her ear, crocodile tears already forming in her eyes. "Yes, officer, he's threatening me. He just said he was going to destroy my car with a tractor. I don't feel safe. I think he might be violent." My jaw tightened as I fought every natural instinct that screamed at me to yell at the sky in frustration. This woman had called the cops on me. Again. The first time she did this, the officers had arrived, seen that she was trespassing, and given her a warning. But Karen had apparently taken that as a challenge instead of a deterrent. Within minutes, I saw the familiar black and white patrol car pull up, the same officer from last time stepping out with an expression that screamed, "Not this again." Officer Miller, a man with the patience of a saint but the exhaustion of a father with triplets, rubbed his temples as he approached. "What's going on now?" Before I could say a word, Karen launched into her performance. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. He's been harassing me, threatening me. He said he'd use his tractor to run my car off the road." She dabbed at her dry eyes dramatically. "I was just trying to have a civil discussion about property lines, and he went completely insane." I exhaled slowly through my nose, forcing myself to keep my expression neutral. Officer Miller sighed, glancing at me. "Is this true?" I gestured at the situation. "She's parked her car across my entrance." Again. I asked her to move. She refused. I mentioned my tractor because, well, I have work to do and she's in the way. Karen gasped like I had just confessed to being an international supervillain. See, he just admitted it. Officer Miller pinched the bridge of his nose, muttering something about needing to switch careers. Karen, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had dealt with this one too many times, you can't block his farm's entrance. Again. Karen squared her shoulders like a defiant rooster in a henhouse. I'm not blocking anything. I'm teaching a lesson. Miller shot her a look so deadpan it could have made plants wilt. Teaching a lesson about what? Karen floundered for a second before lifting her chin. About not being a nuisance in the neighborhood. Miller's sigh could have powered a wind turbine. Karen. He owns the farm. This is his land. He is the neighborhood. She stammered, her brain desperately trying to spin a web that might somehow make her the victim here. But it's unsightly. My guests have to drive past it. It's lowering my property value. He should be fined for running a business in a residential area. I couldn't help it. I let out a short, incredulous laugh. Karen, we live in the countryside. You moved here knowing there were farms. That's what countryside means. Miller shot me a look that said please stop feeding the crazy woman, then turned back to Karen. I'm giving you a choice. Move your car or I'll have it towed. Karen gasped, clutching her pearls like she had just been informed of a personal tragedy. Towed? You wouldn't dare. Miller arched an eyebrow. Oh, I would. And if you pull this again, there will be fines involved. Karen sputtered, her entire face twisting in indignation, but the reality of the situation finally seemed to sink in. Huffing dramatically, she stomped over to her car, muttering something about tyranny and rural people having too much power. She climbed in, slammed the door, and revved the engine with unnecessary aggression before peeling away, tires kicking up dirt like a toddler throwing a tantrum. I turned to Officer Miller, who looked like he aged 5 years in the past 10 minutes. Thanks, I said. He sighed, shaking his head. She's going to be back, you know. I let out a dry chuckle. Oh, I know. And sure enough, she was. But next time, she wasn't just blocking my entrance. Next time, she escalated. I should have known that Karen wasn't done. People like her never just take the loss and move on. They stew, they plot, and they return with an even dumber, more frustrating plan. And sure enough, less than a week later, I woke up to find her back at it, only this time, she had outdone herself. Not only had she parked her car sideways across my entrance again, but she had also dragged out a folding lawn chair, and was now sitting there like she was the queen of this dirt road, a smug, victorious grin plastered across her face as she sipped something from a gaudy pink tumbler. I stood on my porch, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, wondering if I had somehow woken up in an alternate dimension where people like her weren't immediately carted off for psychiatric evaluation. My first instinct was to ignore her, to go about my business and pretend that this wasn't happening, but as I looked past her, I realized she had once again cut off my access to my farm's entrance, and worse, a supplier truck was already idling a few yards down the road, the driver leaning out his window with a look of pure disbelief. I stormed toward her, my boots crunching on gravel, and she lifted her sunglasses just enough to give me a condescending smile. "Morning," she chirped, stretching her legs out a little more, as if she were sunbathing rather than actively ruining my morning. "Lovely day, isn't it?" I stared at her, trying to process how someone could be so aggressively obnoxious before noon. "Karen, what the hell are you doing?" She gave an exaggerated sigh, setting her tumbler down beside her. "I told you. I'm teaching you a lesson. You think you can just run a farm like this without considering how it affects the neighborhood? You think you can just dismiss me? I don't think so. Not this time." I took a deep breath, feeling my eye twitch. "You are blocking my entrance. Again." She raised a single eyebrow, as if daring me to argue. "Yes. And I'll continue to do so until you agree to either move your farm or at least make it look presentable." I ran a hand down my face. Karen, farms don't move. That's not how farms work. She scoffed. Oh, please. You can find another place for your little operation. She waved a dismissive hand at my land, as if my entire livelihood was nothing more than a particularly ugly garden I had planted on a whim. Or at the very least, put up a proper fence, plant some nice flowers, maybe repaint that horrible barn. It's such an eyesore. I clenched my teeth so hard I was surprised they didn't crack. I'm not moving my farm, and I'm not changing anything to suit your aesthetic preferences. Now move your damn car before I do it for you, she gasped, placing a hand over her chest like I had just threatened her with bodily harm. You wouldn't dare. I turned and gestured toward the waiting truck driver, who by this point had gotten out of his cab and was leaning against the door, arms crossed, looking entirely too amused. Hey Mike, I called. Think your truck can push a minivan out of the way? Karen shot up so fast her chair almost tipped over. You will not touch my car. Mike gave a slow shrug, suppressing a grin. I mean I could, but that'd probably scratch up her paint real bad. Karen let out an outraged squawk and fumbled for her phone. You're threatening me again. I'm calling the police. I exhaled sharply, already pulling out my own phone. Good. Let's call them together. Mike chuckled under his breath, muttering, Oh, this is gonna be good. Karen, now flustered that her usual tactic of calling the cops first had been turned against her, started stammering as I dialed the non-emergency line. The second the dispatcher picked up, I calmly explained the situation. A trespassing vehicle blocking my property, the owner refusing to move, and a supply truck being prevented from making its scheduled delivery. The dispatcher's response was immediate and clear. We'll send someone over. Stay where you are. Karen, clearly realizing that things weren't going her way, started trying a new approach. Listen, she said, attempting a forced smile, maybe we don't have to get law enforcement involved. Maybe we can just compromise. I narrowed my eyes. Compromise? You mean I give in and let you dictate how I run my farm? She pressed her lips together, then forced another smile. Well, when you put it that way, it sounds bad. It is bad, Karen. You're bad. This is crazy. Before she could launch into another self-righteous tirade, a familiar patrol car pulled up, and this time, it wasn't Officer Miller. It was someone new, someone younger, with the unfortunate look of a man who still had hope in humanity. That hope was about to be shattered. He stepped out of his car, adjusted his belt, and approached with a professional, if slightly weary, expression. All right, what's going on here? Karen immediately launched into her usual theatrics, painting herself as the poor, helpless victim being terrorized by the big bad farmer and his terrifying delivery truck. The officer listened, nodding occasionally, but his expression remained neutral. Then he turned to me. Sir. I gestured at the scene. She's trespassing on my property again, blocking my entrance, refusing to move her vehicle, and preventing my business operations. The officer sighed, rubbing his forehead. Ma'am, you do realize this is private property, correct? Karen scoffed. It's not private property if it affects the entire neighborhood. This place is an eyesore, and it's bringing down the value of the area. The officer blinked at her. That's not how private property works. Karen huffed. I am a taxpayer. I have rights. Mike, still leaning against his truck, snorted. We all pay taxes, lady. That doesn't mean you get to play traffic controller. The officer shook his head, clearly debating his life choices. Ma'am, if you don't move your vehicle in the next 5 minutes, it will be towed. Karen let out a strangled noise. This is harassment. This is oppression. This is... The officer raised a hand, already pulling out his radio. 4 minutes. Karen's face turned red as she stomped toward her car, flinging open the door like a petulant child. You people are ridiculous, she shouted as she slammed it into reverse and peeled out of the driveway, kicking up dust in her wake. Mike let out a low whistle. I swear, if you told me this was some kind of reality show prank, I'd believe it. The officer gave me a tired look. She's going to keep doing this, isn't she? I sighed. Oh, absolutely. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath before heading back to his patrol car. As he pulled away, I turned to Mike. So, you still delivering my stuff, or do we have to add another Karen delay to the invoice? Mike grinned. Oh, I'm delivering, all right. And I'm adding a Karen tax. I laughed, shaking my head, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Because Karen wasn't the kind of person to walk away from a fight. No, she was the kind of person who doubled down. And the next time she came back, she wasn't just going to block the entrance. She was going to escalate. I should have known Karen wouldn't just let it go. People like her don't just accept defeat. They marinate in their own pettiness until they come up with something even more ridiculous than before. And sure enough, less than a week later, I stepped outside to find a sight so absurd I had to blink a few times just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Karen had outdone herself this time. Not only was her minivan blocking my entrance again, but she had brought reinforcements. Another car, an old, rusted-out sedan that looked like it had been dragged straight from a junkyard, was parked right next to it. And to top it all off, Karen herself was standing between them, arms crossed, radiating smugness like a heat wave. I took a slow breath, trying to rein in the immediate surge of frustration threatening to boil over. Karen, I said, my voice dangerously even, what the hell is this? She tilted her chin up, her eyes sparkling with self-satisfaction. Oh, this, she said, waving a lazy hand at the two cars. This is my protest. I stared at her, then at the ridiculous blockade she had set up. Your protest, I repeated, as if saying it out loud might somehow help me make sense of it. She nodded. That's right. Since you refuse to be a good neighbor and make your farm more presentable, I've decided to take matters into my own hands. I'm staging a peaceful demonstration to raise awareness about how your so-called business is negatively affecting the community. I let out a short, humorless laugh. A peaceful demonstration? You mean illegally blocking access to my property? She scoffed. Oh, please. You act like I'm committing some kind of crime. This is civil disobedience. People do this all the time for causes they believe in. And I believe in keeping this neighborhood beautiful. I rubbed a hand over my face, resisting the urge to let out the longest sigh in human history. Karen, you live a mile down the road. You don't even have to look at my farm unless you go out of your way to drive by. She waved me off. That's not the point. The point is that you refuse to listen to reason, so now I have to escalate things. I gritted my teeth. Move the cars, Karen. She smirked. No, I stared at her, weighing my options. The last 2 times, the cops had been called, and she had been forced to move. But Karen was learning, well, not learning exactly, but adapting. She was getting more creative with her insanity, and I had no doubt that if I called the police again, she would just find another way to escalate. I needed a different approach. Something that would make her regret ever thinking this was a good idea. And then it hit me. All right, I said, shrugging. Have it your way. Without another word, I turned and walked back toward the barn. That's right. Karen called after me. Go sulk inside. Maybe you'll finally realize that I'm not going anywhere until you agree to make some changes around here. I didn't answer. I just kept walking. But instead of going inside to stew in frustration, I went straight for the tractor. If Karen wanted to play stupid games, she was about to win a very stupid prize. Climbing into the driver's seat, I started the engine, the low, powerful rumble shaking the ground beneath me. From my spot in the cab, I could see Karen's expression shift from smugness to confusion as she watched me maneuver the massive machine forward. She took a step back, probably realizing for the first time that I was actually planning to do something. What are you doing? She demanded, her voice laced with uncertainty. I didn't answer. Instead, I drove the tractor right up to the rusted-out sedan, making sure to position the forks underneath it. Karen's eyes widened. Wait. Stop. You can't. I pressed a button, and with a mechanical groan, the tractor lifted the car clean off the ground. Karen let out a strangled shriek. "You can't just move my car." I finally looked at her, feigning confusion. "Oh? I thought this was an abandoned vehicle." "It certainly looks like one. And since it's blocking access to my property, I figured I'd just help clear the way." She was practically vibrating with rage. "That is illegal. You are stealing my property." I sighed dramatically. "Karen, you said this was a peaceful protest. But protests don't usually involve dumping a random broken-down car in front of someone's business, do they?" "No, this just looks like illegal dumping to me. And wouldn't you know it, I happen to have a contract with the county for clearing abandoned vehicles from private property." I paused, letting that sink in. "So really, I'm just doing my civic duty." Her face turned a shade of red I didn't think was humanly possible. You can't do this." But I already had. Shifting the tractor into gear, I slowly but surely carried the junk car across my property and set it down near the road, well out of my way. Karen was still sputtering when I turned back to her. "Now," I said, "you've got about 30 seconds to move your van before I decide that one looks abandoned too." She gaped at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish struggling for air. Then, with a furious screech, she stomped toward her minivan, yanked the door open, and practically threw herself inside. The tires screeched against the gravel as she floored it, speeding off like a bat out of hell. I stood there for a moment, watching her disappear down the road, then turned to find Mike standing by his truck, arms crossed, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. "Oh man," he wheezed, wiping at his eyes. "That was the best thing I've seen all year." I grinned. "You think she'll finally get the message?" He snorted. "Not a chance. But at least you'll have a great story to tell." And he was right. Karen didn't come back that day, but I knew she would eventually. People like her don't just give up. But next time I'd be ready. Because if there was one thing Karen was good at, it was starting trouble. And if there was one thing I was better at, it was finishing it.